Elizabeth Monroe stood at the end of the aisle, her white lace gown clinging to her body like a beautiful burden. The long carpet inside Grand London Church stretched before her like a path to a grave rather than a wedding. Every step she took sounded tiny and fragile in the enormous, silent sanctuary, where gray stone pillars rose high toward the arched ceiling, and the candlelight only made the shadows feel deeper. She was only 22, and she had never imagined her life would become this kind of story. She had grown up in a modest home on the edge of London, where her happiest memories were filled with birdsong in the garden and the scent of her mother's baking drifting from the kitchen. Her mother had died when she was young, leaving her with her father, Henry Monroe, a once hopeful businessman whose failed investments had buried the family in debt. Now Henry looked like a broken version of the man he had once been. His hollow eyes stayed fixed on Elizabeth as he gave her away to Damon Carter, the powerful CEO of Carter Enterprises, a man who controlled a financial empire worth billions. This was not a wedding born from love. It was a deal. Elizabeth was being traded in exchange for the removal of her father's crushing debt and to keep him from going to prison. Her shoes pinched her feet with every step, and the elegant dress felt less like bridal beauty and more like a ceremonial offering laid out before sacrifice. The guests in the polished pews watched her closely. Women in expensive gowns whispered behind their hands, their eyes sharp with pity and curiosity. They knew. Everyone knew this was not a love story. It was a contract wrapped in silk and candlelight. At the far end of the aisle stood Damon Carter, tall, polished, and severe. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit that framed his strong build. His dark hair was slicked neatly back, and his face looked carved from ice. Handsome, but impossible to approach. His eyes were deep, cold, and unreadable. He did not look at her like a groom. He looked at her like a formality. The organ began its solemn notes, low and heavy like a funeral march. The priest, an elderly man with silver hair and a tired voice, began the ceremony. Elizabeth stood beside Damon, close enough to smell his expensive cologne, sandalwood with a trace of mint. It was refined, but distant. He stood like a statue, not once turning to her, not once acknowledging her as anything more than a name on paper. Damon Carter, do you take Elizabeth Monroe to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold, in riches or in poverty, in sickness or in health, till death do you part? The priest asked. A hard silence filled the church. Elizabeth's chest tightened. For one fleeting moment, she hoped he might refuse. She hoped he would walk away and give her freedom back. Then his voice came, calm and flat. I do. Those two words shattered the fragile hope she had clung to. No warmth, no emotion, just a response as empty as signing a business contract. Then it was her turn. Elizabeth Monroe, do you take Damon Carter to be your lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold, in riches or in poverty, in sickness or in health, till death do you part? The priest's eyes softened with pity. Elizabeth's mouth went dry. Every instinct inside her begged her to run, to scream, to tear off the dress and flee the church. But then she looked at her father in the front pew. His head was bowed, his hands trembling in his lap. If she refused, he would go to prison. Their family would be destroyed. I do, she whispered. Her voice was so faint it almost disappeared beneath the organ music. The rings were exchanged. When Damon placed a band on her finger, his touch was cool and precise, like a man completing a transaction. No tenderness, no hesitation. Elizabeth slipped the ring onto his finger with trembling hands, as if sealing a bond neither of them wanted. You may now kiss the bride, the priest said. For the first time, Damon turned to face her. His dark eyes met hers, sharp and cold as a blade. He leaned down and brushed his lips against her cheek. It was brief, formal, detached, a ceremonial touch, not a kiss. Then he stepped back as if the moment had no meaning at all. The guests applauded politely, but the sound felt hollow, like the closing scene of a play everyone had already understood. Elizabeth stood frozen, her heart pounding not with joy, but with dread. She was a bride, but not in any dream she had ever known. She was a signed agreement. As they left the church, whispers followed her like ghosts. Damon guided her toward a sleek black Bentley waiting at the curb. His hand hovered near her back, never quite touching, more escort than husband. The car door shut with a final, coffin-like sound, and they moved through the misty streets of London. Inside the vehicle, the silence was thick enough to suffocate. Elizabeth sat rigid, her hands locked in her lap, the ring on her finger catching the passing streetlights like a warning. Rain began to fall outside, streaking the glass like tears. Damon sat beside her, still and composed, his hands resting on his knees. Elizabeth glanced at him, searching his face for any sign of feeling. Anything. A flicker of regret, a sign of uncertainty. But he remained untouched by emotion, like a statue carved from frozen stone. She had assumed he would remain distant forever. She imagined arriving at his home, a grand but lifeless place, where he would leave her in a corner and ignore her just as he had in the church. But when the car turned down a quieter street, she noticed something. His hand, which had rested calmly on his knee, had tightened into a fist. The knuckles were white. It was the first hint that he was not as detached as he appeared. Her heart began to beat faster, not in hope, but in warning. "Where are we going?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. Damon turned to her for the first time since the ceremony. "My place," he said. His tone was low, clipped, and final. Then he looked away again. The answer did not comfort her. It made her understand that this was not a home. It was his domain. Soon the Bentley pulled up before a towering glass skyscraper. The lobby lights shimmered on the wet pavement, lighting Damon's face for an instant. He got out first, then came around to her side. When he opened the door, he offered his hand. It was not gentle. It was the sort of gesture a man gives when duty demands it. Elizabeth took it anyway. His fingers were cold. The rain soaked the hem of her dress as she stepped out into the night, and she realized with a sinking certainty that this evening would not pass in the quiet indifference she had expected. Welcome to True Life Tales. Chapter 2. The First Night and Possession. Damon's penthouse sat at the top of a glass tower in central London, high above the city, luxurious and frigid at once, as if carved from ice. The white marble floor gleamed beneath the overhead lights, reflecting every beam from the modern pendants above. The room was decorated in a severe minimalist style, a black leather sofa with straight edges, a glass coffee table without a scratch, and a few abstract paintings on the white walls that added nothing warm or personal. The enormous floor-to-ceiling windows revealed London wrapped in fog. Street lights and distant buildings blurred together into faint golden smudges, as though the city itself had slipped into a dream. Elizabeth stood in the middle of the vast living room, still in her wedding gown, the fabric heavy against her skin like a reminder of the day she had just survived. She had become the wife of a man she barely knew through a marriage arranged by force and signed with legal precision. Damon stood several paces away, still immaculate in the black suit he had worn throughout the ceremony. His gray eyes moved over her slowly, as though she were something valuable yet inconvenient that he had acquired. He removed his overcoat with deliberate calm and hung it near the door. Then, with a voice stripped of warmth, he said, "Your room is on the left. Second door." No smile, no explanation, just a curt instruction. Elizabeth nodded quietly, gripping her dress with nervous fingers as she crossed the marble floor, the click of her heels echoing through the emptiness. Her bedroom was smaller but just as cold. A large bed stood in the center with spotless white sheets. A glass wardrobe held a few neatly arranged outfits, and a wide window looked out over the city. Everything was arranged with such perfect order that the room felt untouched by real life. She closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling deeply, trying to release the tension pressing on her chest. She changed out of the wedding dress, letting the white silk slide to the floor. In the wardrobe, she found a pale silk nightgown that must have been prepared by someone on Damon's staff. She put it on and crawled into bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. She was exhausted enough to sleep, or so she thought. The bedroom door suddenly opened. Elizabeth jolted upright. Standing in the doorway was Damon, but he looked different from the man she had seen earlier. The top buttons of his white shirt were undone, revealing the shape of his chest. His tie hung loosely around his neck, and his black hair was slightly messy, as though he had run a hand through it in frustration. But what stopped her breathing was his expression. His eyes burned with something dark and restless. A fire had surfaced inside him, intense and almost hungry. He stepped into the room slowly, the sound of his shoes against the floor soft but deliberate. Elizabeth clutched the blanket to her chest, unsure whether to speak or retreat. His gaze held hers so directly that she felt trapped beneath it. He stopped beside the bed and leaned down, his voice low and rough. "How do you think I could sleep knowing you belong to me?" The words were not a question. They were a claim. Elizabeth had no time to answer before he reached for her wrist and pulled her up from the bed. The blanket fell away. She stood trembling in the thin nightgown, while he moved her back step by step until her shoulders touched the cool wall behind her. His breath brushed her cheek, hot and urgent, so different from the coldness she had known all day. Then his lips found hers. The kiss was fierce, possessive, and overwhelming. As if he were staking a claim, he had no intention of surrendering. Elizabeth panicked at first. She had never been kissed like this. Her previous experiences were soft, awkward, and youthful. This was something else entirely. Intense, powerful, and frighteningly confident. Yet beneath that force, something in him felt raw, something unstable, something almost vulnerable. The moment pulled her into a confusion of fear, heat, and emotion she had not expected. That night they crossed a line between strangers. The first time was gentler than she expected. His hands moved slowly, exploring as though he were trying not to break something fragile. Elizabeth, though frightened and inexperienced, gradually stopped resisting. The coldness of the room gave way to warmth, and for a short while she felt less like a prisoner and more like a woman being seen. He whispered her name as though it meant something new to him. Then came the second time. This time he was more desperate, more intense, consumed by a passion that seemed to rise beyond his control. He held her tightly, kissed her with a demand that left no room for hesitation, and Elizabeth felt herself carried along by his strength even while her mind struggled to keep up. At one point he breathed into her ear, "You don't know what you do to me." His voice was strong, but there was a crack in it, something unguarded. By the end, their bodies were no longer locked in possession or fear. They were tangled in something deeper, quieter, and far more complicated. Damon pulled her against his chest and held her close on the bed, one arm around her waist, as if he feared she might disappear if he loosened his grip. Elizabeth listened to the steady rhythm of his breathing and the sound of rain tapping against the window. The city lights filtered through the fog, like scattered stars. His expression had softened. For the first time, she sensed that this night had not only changed her, it had changed him too. They lay there in silence, breathing in sync, and Elizabeth felt something she had not dared to feel in months. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Chapter 3. Love blossoming between two worlds. The months after the wedding slipped by slowly inside the penthouse, like a long melody gradually finding harmony. Outside, London remained draped in mist and rain, but inside the glass walls of the apartment, something subtle was beginning to shift. Damon Blackwood, once as cold as steel, started revealing tiny cracks in the shell he had built around himself. Elizabeth saw it in small gestures that meant everything to her. One morning she woke to find a book on her bedside table, Jane Eyre, the novel she had mentioned only once during a brief conversation with him weeks earlier. A short note was tucked inside. "For you, D." No explanation followed. When she asked him about it later, he only shrugged and looked away, as if it had not mattered. But to Elizabeth, it was the first light breaking through the fog. Then there were the breakfasts. Sometimes she would enter the kitchen and catch the smell of burnt toast in the air. Damon would be standing there in a white shirt with rolled sleeves, glaring at a frying pan like it had personally insulted him. "I'm not good at this," he muttered once, placing a blackened plate of toast and a cup of coffee in front of her. It was awkward, almost comical, but it was his way of trying. Elizabeth smiled and ate the toast anyway. Later, they began walking together in the evenings beneath the warm yellow street lamps. Damon would take her hand, his grip firm but no longer forced, and Elizabeth began to wonder if the man she had married in that freezing church was slowly becoming someone else entirely. Their connection did not bloom all at once. It deepened gradually, like water shaping stone. Elizabeth began to learn more about him in fragments. One evening they sat together in the living room while the fireplace crackled softly. Damon, staring into the flames, told her about his childhood. He had grown up in a powerful family, pressured to become the perfect heir, expected never to fail, never to feel too much, never to show weakness. Then he spoke of his sister, Emily. She had been younger than him, full of life, the brightest person in his home. 10 years earlier, on a wet and dangerous night, he had driven her home after a birthday party. He had been distracted by an argument with his father over the phone. The car crashed into a tree. Emily died. I heard her scream, he whispered, his hand curling into a fist. I was supposed to protect her. I was the one who killed her. Elizabeth sat beside him, silent and heartbroken, watching tears escape a man who had never allowed himself to break in front of anyone before. From that day, she became the comfort he had never been given. She did not try to fix him. Some wounds could not be fixed. She simply stayed beside him on the nights he woke from nightmares, holding his hand until the darkness loosened its grip. In return, he became her shield. When the elite circles of London whispered that she was only a contract bride, that she did not belong in Damon Carter's world, he stepped in front of her and shut the criticism down. She's my wife, he said coldly. I don't want to hear another word. For the first time, Elizabeth no longer felt alone in the marriage. They began spending time outside the penthouse, too, walking in Hyde Park, where Damon bought her ice cream while pretending it was too sweet, or taking her to a small West End theater because he knew she loved it, not through grand declarations, but through small, sincere moments. The walls between them began to fall. Elizabeth was no longer afraid of him, and Damon, though he never openly admitted it, smiled more often. They were rare smiles, but they lit up his gray eyes in a way she had never seen before. Then one stormy night, while rain struck the windows hard enough to blur the city beyond, the truth finally surfaced. Elizabeth was sitting on the sofa reading Jane Eyre when Damon returned from his study, his sleeves rolled up and his hair damp from the balcony. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a long moment. Then, to her complete surprise, he knelt before her. His hands closed around hers with gentle urgency. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "I didn't want this marriage at first. It was only a contract, a way to keep everything under control. But now I can't live without you." The confession broke through everything he had built around himself. Elizabeth cried silently. Then she leaned down and kissed him, tenderly this time, with certainty instead of fear. When they separated, Damon pulled her into his arms and whispered, "I want a family with you." Elizabeth smiled through her tears. Months later, she discovered she was pregnant. When she told him on a quiet morning, Damon went still before dropping to one knee and holding her close, his joy unmistakable and raw. "Our child," he whispered, his hand resting against her stomach. For the first time, Elizabeth saw him smile fully, without restraint. They began imagining the future together, a nursery, a home beyond the penthouse, a place where their child could grow in peace. But even as love bloomed between them, shadows from his past began to stir again. One evening she heard his voice from the study, tense and low. "No, I told you I'm done with that. It ended long ago." When he came out, his face had gone pale and distant again. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said. But Elizabeth knew. Something from the past had returned. Chapter 4. Bankruptcy and a Fateful Turn. The penthouse, once a symbol of power and control, turned into a battlefield on a bleak winter morning when the empire Damon had built began to collapse. Outside the windows, London was hidden behind heavy fog. Inside, the living room was covered with financial newspapers, their headlines like knives aimed at his pride. Carter Enterprises faces fraud accusations. Stocks fall amid scandal. Damon Carter, from business king to suspected swindler. Elizabeth stood near the wall, one hand resting on her swollen belly. She was 7 months pregnant and watched him with deep worry as he sat on the sofa. Phone pressed to his ear, barking instructions. Find out who's behind this. He already knew the answer. Victor Grayson, an old rival and former partner, had been setting this trap for months. Once involved with the company, Victor had grown bitter after falling out and now wanted revenge. He spread stories that Damon had stolen millions and concealed a massive debt. The lies spread quickly through tabloids and London's business circles. Carter Enterprises lost 60% of its value in just 3 days. Investors fled. Banks demanded repayment. Lawyers warned of lawsuits. The empire was sinking. Elizabeth stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Damon, please rest. I'm worried about you." He brushed her hand away. "Rest," he snapped, "when the whole world is turning on me?" The words stung, but she did not leave. She knew he was fighting more than the scandal. He was battling fear, humiliation, and the memory of a life he had worked too hard to build. He worked nonstop, long nights in the study, cold coffee cups scattered across the desk, papers stacked everywhere, calls with lawyers, accountants, and the few loyal investors who had not abandoned him yet. "Find every piece of evidence," he said during one conference call, slamming his hand against the table. "I won't let Victor win." But every day things got worse. Banks refused loans. Partners canceled contracts. Employees began quitting. Damon became distant and sharp. The man who once held Elizabeth's hand and spoke of family was now a shadow of himself. Still, she tried to support him. She brought him coffee, laid blankets over his shoulders when he passed out at his desk, and tried to understand the financial documents spread across the study. Each time, he pushed her away. One night she entered carrying a plate of sandwiches. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Elizabeth, I don't need you here. You don't understand any of this. Get out." The sharpness in his voice made the plate slip from her hands and crashed to the floor. Tears filled her eyes, but she said nothing. She turned away and held her belly tightly. The distance between them hurt more than she could say. The future they had dreamed of now felt like a memory. She sat alone in the bedroom and whispered to the baby, "Your dad will be okay. Liam, I won't let us lose him." She had chosen the name Liam because it meant strong protector. She hoped their son would bring strength into both their lives. But the real collapse came one rainy afternoon. Victor had not been satisfied with rumors. He teamed up with James Carter, a former employee Damon had fired years earlier for fraud. Together they forged documents, transfer receipts, fabricated contracts, fake emails, all designed to prove Damon had stolen company funds to cover personal debts. The evidence was false, but it was convincing enough. Police stormed into Carter Enterprises. Computers were seized. Files were taken. Damon stood in the chaos, furious and helpless. "This is a setup," he roared. "I'll prove I'm innocent." A few days later, the police came to the penthouse. Elizabeth sat on the sofa, knitting a tiny wool hat for Liam, when the door slammed open. 3 officers stepped inside, followed by an investigator in a gray suit. "Damon Carter," the lead officer said coldly, "you are under arrest for financial embezzlement and corporate fraud." Elizabeth leapt to her feet, the hat slipping from her hands. "No, he didn't do anything wrong. You have the wrong man." She clung to Damon's hand, crying desperately, but the officers ignored her and cuffed him anyway. The sound of metal locking around his wrists echoed like a final judgment. He did not resist. Before they led him away, he turned to her and said softly, "Take care of yourself and the baby. I'll come back." But the door slammed shut, and the promise disappeared into the rain. The trial moved quickly. The false documents were enough to silence the truth. Damon was sentenced to 5 years in prison for crimes he had not committed. No one cared what was real. The bank seized the penthouse. Elizabeth watched as officials sealed the door, holding a small bag with a few clothes and the copy of Jane Eyre Damon had given her. She had no money, no home, and no one except the unborn child in her womb. She was forced to move to a shabby apartment in East London. The walls were damp, the sink rusted, and the alley outside was full of trash and shouting neighbors. It was a hard place to survive. She sat on the old bed, rubbing her belly. "I can do this for Liam," she whispered. "For Damien." 3 months later, in a crowded public hospital, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby boy through pain and loneliness. His cries echoed through the delivery room like the first sound of hope in a broken life. She held him close and stared into his blue eyes, so much like Damon's. "Liam," she whispered, "you'll be my protector, and I'll protect you." A nurse gave her a bracelet marked Liam Blackwood, which she slipped onto his wrist with shaking hands. She returned to the rundown apartment and chose to raise him alone while waiting for Damon. She got a part-time job at a nearby grocery store, though her body was still weak after childbirth. At night she sat by the window and sang softly to Liam, her voice trembling with exhaustion and love. She grieved the home they had lost, the future they had imagined, and the man she loved. But she never stopped waiting. Chapter 5. 2 years in darkness. Elizabeth's small apartment in East London was a far cry from the penthouse she had once shared with Damon. Each morning she woke under a leaking roof, the sound of rain dripping onto the floor, the air damp with mildew and smoke from the alley below. The furniture was old and fragile, a wobbly table, a torn chair, a rusted stove. Yet one thing never changed. On the table sat her wedding photo with Damon in a cheap plastic frame. In the picture, he stood in a perfect black suit, his expression cold, but with a hint of softness in his eyes. Elizabeth had cut the image from a happier time and kept it like a flame she refused to let go of. It reminded her that he was still out there somewhere. She worked long shifts at a grocery store a few streets away. The pay was poor, but it helped feed Liam and keep the lights on. She stood behind the counter for hours, packing groceries for tired workers, mothers, and impatient customers, her feet aching by the end of each shift. The money barely covered rent, milk, and bread, but she never complained. When the owner, Alf, once asked why she did not move on and find another man, she only smiled and said, "I already have my man, Alf. He'll come back." Alf laughed sadly and shook his head, but she did not care. She had Liam, and she had hope. Every evening, she played with her son on the worn rug, singing him lullabies, carrying him in her arms, and watching his black hair and blue eyes grow more like Damon's every day. Sometimes Liam would pause and stare at the wedding photo with innocent curiosity. Elizabeth could not explain everything, but she held him close and made him feel safe. Far away, in a prison on the outskirts of England, Damon lived in a different kind of hell. 2 years behind bars had changed him. He was thinner now, his face sharper, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The prison uniform hung loosely on him. He no longer looked like the powerful businessman the world once feared. The worst part was not the food, the cold bed, or the gray walls. It was the other prisoners. They mocked him for once living in luxury. They called him the king without a throne. Some attacked him in dark corners of the prison yard. He learned to keep his head down and survive. He did not fight back much anymore. Every bruise carried the weight of humiliation. He wrote to Elizabeth every week on crumpled paper, trying to hold on to hope. "I'm still okay. Take care of Liam and yourself. I'll come back." But the prison system was unreliable. Letters were lost. Others never reached her. When no reply came, Damon began to fear the worst. He sat alone in his cell and wondered if Elizabeth had forgotten him. "She's given up on me," he whispered in the dark. The thought that Liam might call another man Dad tortured him more than any injury he had suffered in prison. What he did not know was that Elizabeth had never stopped waiting. She kept his letters in an old tin box beneath the bed and read them on rainy nights after Liam fell asleep, crying silently as she touched the words he had written. She could not visit him. There was no money for the trip and no one to watch Liam. Still, she never lost faith. Then, on a cold winter afternoon, everything changed. The roof leaked. Rain battered the windows. Elizabeth had just come home from work, soaked and exhausted, Liam wrapped in a thin blanket against the cold. She was warming milk in the kitchen when someone knocked at the door. When she opened it, Victor Grayson stood there in an expensive gray suit, looking completely out of place in her poor neighborhood. His smile was thin and cruel. "Elizabeth Blackwood," he said smoothly, "you look worse than I expected." She held Liam closer and frowned. "What do you want?" Victor stepped inside without being invited and placed a thick stack of money on the table. "I'm here to help you," he said. "You and the boy need a better life. House, clothes, school for Liam. All you have to do is abandon Damon. Say you're done with him." Elizabeth stared at the cash, then at Victor. "Who do you think I am?" she said, her voice rising. "A dog you can buy." Victor's smirk widened. "I think you're practical. Damon won't be getting out anytime soon. I'll make sure of that. Do you really want your child growing up in this hole?" His words cut deep, but she did not waver. She picked up a glass of water from the table and threw it in his face. "I'd rather die than betray him," she shouted. "Get out of my house." Victor's smile vanished. His eyes hardened. "You'll regret this, Elizabeth. Damon will never come back to you. You and the boy will have nothing." Then he turned and left. Elizabeth shut the door behind him and leaned against it, breathing hard. Liam looked up from the chair and asked in a small voice, "Where's Dad, Mommy?" The question shattered her heart. She crouched beside him and held him tight. "Dad is far away, sweetheart," she whispered. "But he'll come back. I promise." That night the rain never stopped. Water dripped through the roof and pooled beside the bed, while Elizabeth held Liam close and watched him sleep. The wedding photo glowed faintly in the light of a small lamp. She feared Victor's threat. She feared Damon would return changed beyond recognition. And she feared the darkness was only beginning. Chapter 6. Reunion and a New Beginning. One early spring morning, the London sky finally cleared. For the first time in years, sunlight slipped through the fog and touched the streets below. The prison gates opened. After 2 years behind bars, Damon Blackwood stepped into freedom. He was no longer the polished man who had once ruled Carter Enterprises. He was gaunt, his hair longer and unkempt, his face marked by small scars. But his eyes still carried a fierce determination. He had one goal now. Find Elizabeth. Find Liam. Bring his family back. A young lawyer named Michael Reed, who had once worked for Carter Enterprises, had refused to let the truth stay buried. After months of investigation, he uncovered the truth behind Victor's scheme. Fake emails, forged receipts, altered contracts. Even James Carter's testimony had been exposed as false with the help of secret recordings. The court reopened the case. Damon was declared innocent. Victor was arrested for fraud and slander. James faced charges for perjury. Damon left prison with only a small canvas bag and a stack of old letters he had written but was never sure she received. Michael handed him a bus ticket and told him to go find her. When Damon reached East London, the narrow alleys and worn-down buildings felt like another world. He found the building from the address Michael had given him and climbed the old stairs with a pounding heart. At apartment number 7, he paused. Through the thin crack beneath the door, he heard Elizabeth's voice, soft and warm. "Sleep, my little Liam, under London's sky." The sound hit him like medicine. He looked through the opening and saw her sitting on a chair with Liam asleep in her lap. She was thinner now, her sweater worn, but she was still beautiful to him. Beside her on the table sat the wedding photo, cleaned carefully and placed like a tiny flame in the middle of hardship. He knocked. Elizabeth stopped singing. She opened the door and froze when she saw him. For one long moment, neither moved. Then Elizabeth rushed forward and threw her arms around him. "You're back," she cried. Damon held her tightly, his own tears falling into her hair. "I'm back," he said. I'm sorry I left you alone." The two of them stood in the doorway, crying into each other's shoulders, while the wind moved through the alley outside. Years of pain seemed to break apart in that moment. When Elizabeth pulled him inside, Damon's eyes fell on Liam sleeping in the chair. He knelt beside the boy, his hand trembling as he touched his son's black hair. Liam slowly opened his eyes and looked at him shyly. Elizabeth whispered, "Liam, this is your dad." The child blinked, looked at both of them, and then said softly, "Dad." The word shattered Damon completely. He pulled Liam into his arms and held him like something precious that had finally come home. "Yes, son," he whispered. "It's Dad. I'll never leave you again." Liam wrapped his small arms around his neck, and Damon felt his wounds begin to heal. Later, they sat together and spoke of all they had endured. Elizabeth told him about the grocery store, the leaking roof, and how she had kept the wedding photo as a symbol of hope. Damon told her about the prison, the letters, and the fear that she had moved on without him. "I thought you didn't need me anymore," he admitted. Elizabeth shook her head. "Never, Damon. I promised I'd wait, and I did." He kissed her then, gently and deeply, a kiss shaped by suffering, faith, and the long road back to each other. Months later, the small family left East London and moved into a modest house in the suburbs, bought with the compensation from the lawsuit against Victor. It was simple, with a red-tiled roof and a little garden of weeds and lavender. But it was theirs. Liam laughed in the yard. Sunlight filled the windows. The rain was gone. With Michael's help, Damon opened a small coffee shop nearby and named it Liam's Brew. He worked behind the counter with awkward sincerity, and customers loved him for it. Elizabeth began teaching children at home, turning their living room into a bright little classroom. Together, they built a quiet, happy life. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched Liam run through the garden. Damon held Elizabeth's hand and said, "I never thought I deserved this. You and Liam." She rested her head on his shoulder. "We deserve it," she told him. And under the clear suburban sky, they were no longer a millionaire and a contract bride. They were a family, a new beginning forged from pain, patience, and love. Their story is not only a romance, it is a story of healing, resilience, and the kind of love that survives even the darkest nights. No matter how hard life becomes, when the people you love are beside you, every new beginning becomes worth it. Damon was no longer the cold millionaire. Elizabeth was no longer the contract bride. They were a family, and that was the greatest treasure they found after everything they endured. Thank you for being part of True Life Tales.